Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. It was 100 years ago that the state historian of South Dakota wrote a letter to a sculptor in Connecticut asking simply, will you come out here and create something that will attract out-of-state tourists? Well, that project wound up becoming the iconic Mount Rushmore National Memorial in the beautiful Black Hills of South Dakota. Our guest today is Sarah Beth Cox, who goes by her title Ranger Sarah Beth when she's on duty at Mount Rushmore. And she's got the incredible story of how Mount Rushmore came to be and how Connecticut's Gutzon Borglum and his son Lincoln literally made the monument what it is. Ranger Sarah Beth will be along in just a moment with this fascinating story. This week's trivia question: when you hear the old saying, go peddle your wares elsewhere, what Connecticut invention was it originally referring to? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. The famous sculptor Gutzon Borglum was born in Idaho, so you can't say he was a native of Connecticut. He was in fact a transplant, and he lived in Stamford for just 10 years. But his son Lincoln was born in Stamford, and more importantly, it was during those 10 years that Borglum got the letter of a lifetime, at least for a sculptor, an invitation to carve an attraction into the granite rock in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Well, together, he and his son Lincoln would head out there and become the visionaries and creators of the Mount Rushmore National Memorial, undertaking, frankly, one of the most spectacular artistic projects in this country's history. Well, here today to tell us the story of how these Connecticut residents brought Mount Rushmore to life is Sarah Beth Cox, better known to Mount Rushmore visitors as Ranger Sarah Beth. Sarah Beth, what I'd love to do with this interview is to convey to people just how important and significant this monument is to the United States, what it says about the United States. And, I think to do this, we have to go back and look at all the positives and the negatives of everything from how the land was obtained by the federal government to what faces are on Mount Rushmore and why. And there's so many messages in there. So let's just go back to the beginning. And this, of course, like all the land in North America before European settlers arrived, was where Native American tribes were living, and there was no difference there in South Dakota. Let's go back to the 1800s and what happened in terms of the conveyance of the land from the Sioux Indian tribe to the federal government.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. The concept of indigenous land ownership and land rights is something that we talk about very actively here. It definitely shapes the Black Hills of South Dakota and Mount Rushmore in particular. The Black Hills are a very unique place. The Black Hills is sometimes called the island in the plains. It's this oasis of incredibly lush land, and it's where people like the Lakota have their emergence story. The Lakota, or sometimes called the Sioux, are the ones that come up most often when we have these conversations. As we start to see settlers passing through this area, at that time, the Sioux were the ones that were primarily in this area. And in particular, their name ended up attached to this area very, very strongly because they are the ones that signed the 1864 Fort Laramie Treaty. And that's a treaty that said essentially the entire western half of South Dakota is going to be in perpetuity unceded Indian territory. And that proceeded to happen for about 10 years until the Custer expedition came to this area and published the finding of gold in the Black Hills. And very shortly after that, we start to see this mass amount of Euro-American settlers moving into this area, capitalizing on this gold rush that's happening in this area. Very quickly, the United States government realizes that they can't stop that influx effectively and that they probably don't really want to. This is a very resource-rich area, and suddenly it is being occupied by Euro-American settlers. So very shortly after that, we start to see things like treaty lines being redrawn. With that, the land that the indigenous people are allowed to access very, very quickly shrinks into these small, confined reservations, essentially along the same lines of what we see in modern day. And that's a really devastating time for the indigenous folks. Moving across the plains and into the Black Hills seasonally, a lot of their lifeways were based off of moving with the landscape and with the resources, with the seasons. And so suddenly being confined to very small areas, it restricts those traditional lifeways. It cuts them off from a lot of really significant food sources, and it essentially forces folks into poverty. And this is something that turns into a very long-running issue, something that we're still grappling with and contending with as a nation today. In the 1920s, the Sioux Nation decides to take this to court, and that court battle drags on until 1980, when the United States Supreme Court says, yes, this is stolen land. That treaty was violated illegally and unconstitutionally, and that land should never have been occupied by Euro-American settlers. At that point, we're kind of left with this question of, what do we do now? It's been so thoroughly settled. There are homes, businesses, people who have lived their entire lives in this area, and it's really hard to take all of that back. So at that time, the Supreme Court makes the decision to offer a monetary settlement. However, the Sioux Nation declines those funds. They say, we don't want the money, we want the land. To this day, that money is still sitting in bank accounts, accruing interest, and we have very active conversations where folks are still advocating for the return of the land itself, and that the money will not compensate effectively because it will not restore the spirituality and the traditional lifeways. In particular, as soon as that money is taken, there's this belief that that's acknowledging that Euro-Americans have a right to be on this land. You mentioned before that the entire North America continent is traditionally indigenous land. Everywhere we go, we're stepping on land that was in some way formerly occupied by Native Americans, and today either is a reservation land or is fully ceded as American territory. But we don't think about that the way we think about it when we're in a place like Mount Rushmore, where it's right on the surface, where these are conversations that are actively being had every single day.
So now that we've established this base, let's fast forward and talk about the actual development of Mount Rushmore as this monument to the United States and its sort of westward push. And I guess it was in 1924 that the state historian for South Dakota, a gentleman named Doane Robinson, wrote to a very noted sculptor who at the time was living in Connecticut named Gutzon Borglum. And what did he ask him to do?
When Doane Robinson reached out to Gutzon Borglum, he first presented a pretty vague idea. It was carving a mountainside in the state of South Dakota as a tourist attraction. Doane Robinson already had a pretty good idea of what he wanted that to look like, what he wanted it to consist of, and where he wanted it located. But the initial communication to Borglum was essentially, I have this idea, are you interested? And immediately Borglum writes back, great idea you have, hold to it, and begins planning a visit to the Black Hills.
Now, when he goes out there, I guess that, and I don't want to get too specific on this, but Robinson had in mind an area of South Dakota called the Needles, and I guess Borglum and his son Lincoln, who will be his right-hand man in this project, the two of them come out, and in two separate visits, they realize that the Needles is probably not the best location to start carving this, and they end up finding Mount Rushmore. Do I have that right?
That's absolutely correct. The Borglums end up on sort of a 2-week horseback trip through the Black Hills trying to find the perfect mountain, and keeping in mind that during these trips, Lincoln Borglum is only 12 years old. He described himself at the time as his father's shadow. So he's along on this trip trying to help his father identify the ideal mountainside to be carved. The Needles are very tall, thin granite spires and were simply too weathered to be able to carve. And Borglum sets out through the Black Hills with the help of the forester and a couple of geologists from the South Dakota School of Mines. And with them, they identify the mountain that we call today Mount Rushmore. He liked that because it had this nice, broad, flat face. It had a large area for carving, and of course, through his artist eye, he noticed that it faced the southeast, so it would catch the first rays of the rising sun and stay in the sun through most of the day.
That's a great observation, and of course, Borglum was not new to this whole concept of carving faces into rock. He was working on Stone Mountain in Georgia at the time, which it's a Confederate memorial. Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, the three prominent faces that are carved into that mountain, and all sorts of talk during the time of the Ku Klux Klan being behind the financing of this and sort of the idea of this. Can you sort of put that into the historic perspective of the 1920s? Was there any consternation or concern that they're bringing a guy like Borglum working on a project like that to South Dakota to work on this project?
Yeah, you make some really interesting points there, as specifically pointing out that today Stone Mountain is considered a very controversial site in terms of its subject matter, but in the time period, we don't see a lot of rhetoric around the actual figures being carved or a lot of conversations around the choice of subject matter. Where we see the controversy in the time period is the conditions and terms under which he left Stone Mountain. He was accused of negligence and of misusing finances while he was working there. Borglum has been noted throughout his entire life as being someone who maybe didn't see a lot of value in close record keeping. He was someone who would spend very quickly and impulsively. He thought his work was worth whatever cost it came at, and he was not shy about voicing that opinion or spending accordingly. And with that, as he starts to argue more and more with the Daughters of the Confederacy who are sponsoring this project, he starts to get on really bad terms with them. Eventually, he's dismissed from the project, and his final act there is to destroy the models that he had made. And that is considered a very criminal act in the eyes of the Daughters of the Confederacy. They had paid and commissioned those models, and so they consider this destruction of their property. And they soon sent out a notice that they planned to have Borglum arrested for that act. So he flees the state of Georgia. At that time, he's being dogged by a lot of criticism in the newspaper, but at the same time, he has his very vocal supporters in the newspaper. It turns into sort of this media battle. And at that time, he had already become involved with this idea of a mountain carving in South Dakota. He had actually come up to visit South Dakota and discuss the possibility of carving while he was still employed at Stone Mountain. The citizens of South Dakota soon moved to the top of the mailing list for the Stone Mountain Association as they're sending out all of these pamphlets that are saying, Gutzon Borglum cannot be trusted with money, Gutzon Borglum cannot follow through on a project like this. But at the same time, Gutzon Borglum always had very influential and very vocal supporters. And so while you do have the Stone Mountain Association arguing that he doesn't know how to spend money, you have people on the other side who are saying things like, he's an artist. He works when the inspiration strikes. He works on his own schedule, of course. And there's witty remarks, things like, well, I wouldn't expect an artist to be even an average businessman, just as I wouldn't expect a good businessman to be even an average artist.
It's fascinating to hear you tell this story because then you stop and think for a second that Borglum goes out there, listens to Robinson about what Robinson thinks ought to be portrayed, and this was going to be some Western heroes that he had in mind. And Borglum, I guess, with his artist perspective, said, no, I think instead we're going to put the faces of four presidents there. Could you explain what Robinson wanted and how that kind of shook things up?
Yeah, absolutely. Robinson was South Dakota's state historian, and while the idea was proposed as a way to bring a tourist industry to the state of South Dakota, it also came from Robinson's very particular interests. So he wanted people who were influential in the history of South Dakota and the West more generally. So Robinson had proposed figures like Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Buffalo Bill Cody, Chief Red Cloud, faces that really shaped this region. But you're correct. As Borglum started to get involved with this project, he very quickly makes it clear that he doesn't think that's the right route to go. He makes an argument that if we want to have tourists from across the nation visit South Dakota, we need to have figures who are recognizable and respected from across the nation. And that's when he shifts the idea to presidents.
And can you speak for a second about the particular presidents who were picked and kind of why each one was there? So it's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and of course Thomas Jefferson. Why were they selected?
Borglum got to choose the presidents on the mountain almost single-handedly. He had invested in this project before there was really any federal oversight or federal funding, so he had a lot of leeway, in addition to being a very strong personality. He very quickly kind of overrode the overall committee that was assigned to this project and turned it into his personal project. He argued that it represented the first 150 years of American history, and particularly those 4 presidents were each figureheads of the major eras of American history up until that point. We have George Washington representing the foundation. Thomas Jefferson is represented for the Louisiana Purchase, not as much for the writing of the Declaration of Independence as we often think of him today. We have Abraham Lincoln for the preservation of the Union through the Civil War. And finally, we have the development of the nation with Theodore Roosevelt. Borglum did not speak to things like land conservation. He spoke to things like creation of the Panama Canal and the antitrust laws. He really appreciated Roosevelt for putting America on the world stage, so to speak, and helping to develop the young nation.
I want to give the just due to Borglum's son, Lincoln Borglum. And as you said, he was 12 years old on horseback when he first came out to South Dakota with his dad to look around and see what was there. But he started off working first for no money, then he got an hourly wage, then he was chief pointer, which I'd love to hear you explain what that was, then superintendent, and then after his dad died, he became sculptor. How important was Lincoln Borglum to this overall project?
Lincoln Borglum ends up being absolutely essential to this project. In some ways, he is considered the unsung hero because when we talk about Mount Rushmore, generally we refer to the entire team of workers because they are all equal in their contributions. And then we speak to Gutzon Borglum for being really the artist who made this possible and directed the work. But Lincoln Borglum falls somewhere in the middle. He was not the primary artist, but this work would not have been possible to the level of completion that we see today without him. But he also often was working alongside the rest of those workers. So he's in a really interesting position. And as he moves through those positions, his role really changes and develops. He plans to pursue engineering at the University of Virginia. However, his father really wanted to keep him close and told him that he would appreciate Lincoln stepping in as a pointer on the mountain. And that's a really important and really skilled role. The carving of Mount Rushmore was completed through the use of a scale model. It's a 1/12 scale model, so every inch on the model equals a foot on the mountain. It made the conversions nice and easy. But when you're carving on this kind of scale, you have to be really careful with how that information is communicated up onto the mountainside. And that's the job of the pointer. It gets that name pointer because it used a system called the pointing system. Essentially, it is a device mounted on the top of the model's head that allows them to take a 3-dimensional measurement. It'd be the pointer's job to record all of those measurements on the model and then head out onto the mountainside with a bucket of red paint. And all across the mountainside, the pointer would paint out the day's instructions. It might look something like remove 2 feet of rock here, remove 10 feet of rock there. As they get closer and more detailed, the pointer's instructions are going to get a lot more refined. So Lincoln Borglum being given that position, even though it wasn't unpaid at the time, was a really strong incentive for him to stay. And indeed, taking that on as an unpaid role for the first several years, it shows that Lincoln had this dedication to the project very much on the level of his father.
And just to give people a sense of what they were dealing with, these are people who are basically hanging off the top of the mountain with ropes and sitting, I assume, in some sort of harness, chiseling, using dynamite at different times. This was a very difficult process, right?
The tools that they use here cover a really wide spectrum, and it's rather genius that they were able to carve on the level and scale that they were. So with that, the average day of one of the actual carvers on the mountainside would include walking up the 600-some steps to the top to sit in a small wooden chair called a bosun chair, and then attach themselves to a steel cable about as big around as my pinky finger. That steel cable would be wound around a winch, and from there, the person standing at the winch would lower them onto the mountainside. And there's a really large element of trust here. Once you are lowered over that mountainside, you are totally at the mercy of the person standing at the handle of that winch. also a really strong element of communication because it is a dangerous job. Not only do you need to communicate the details to do the job well, like where to carve and how deep, but you also need to make sure that everybody is strategically placed on the mountain so that as you have these 35 or 50-pound air-powered jackhammers drilling directly into granite, you're being mindful of the other people around you. It's being very careful to make sure that no one is placed below another person in case of any rock fall. They did also coordinate the daily dynamite blasts to make sure that everybody would be up the mountain. There were 2 dynamite blasts a day, one at the noon lunch break and one at the end of the working day.
Let's take one date in particular, March 6, 1941. This is the day that Gutzon Borglum dies, and Lincoln Borglum has to step into his shoes. Now, this was happening as the project was winding down, right?
That's correct. From the very first drill bit into the mountain to the very last day of drilling, that's about 14 years. The last drill into the mountain happens on October 31st of 1941. So it's really just a few months from the time that Gutzon Borglum passed away to the final drilling on the mountainside. Lincoln Borglum very quickly steps into that role of sculptor for the project. And at that point, it is essentially refining the work that's already been done. More than anything, Lincoln Borglum saw through the work that was already in progress and then planned the process to remove the scaffolding, move the equipment off the mountain, and kind of wrap up the work.
And if you would, tell us what you can about this infamous 70-foot tunnel that's behind Abe Lincoln's head.
The Hall of Records. Not a secret at all. We've got documentaries, books, and entire films about it. It just happens to be out of view from the ground. So when you think of the top of Mount Rushmore, there are actually 2 rock ridges up there. This is the one that we can see from the vantage point, which is the one with the faces carved on it. And then there's a second rock ridge. And in that second rock ridge, there's a tunnel that's roughly hewn. It goes back about 70 feet and kind of tapers off as it goes. And that was where the Borglums intended to do what they called the Hall of Records. Originally, Gutzon Borglum had intended an entire museum carved into the mountainside. He envisioned it hosting the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution. He imagined it being a history museum of the United States with great tall busts of influential Americans spread across the hall. One thing he did not account for was exactly how hard it is to drill straight back into solid granite, or how much time and money it would take. In addition, at that point that he undertook the project, it was federally funded, and the federal funding very specifically said it was for the sculpting of the faces of the presidents on Mount Rushmore. So as he took about $16,000 from the budget to start carving that Hall of Records, it was technically a bit of a misappropriation of federal funds, and he was told that it was not part of the budget and that he needed to stop that project. And for a long time, that sat as an empty, roughly hewn tunnel going straight back into that second rock ridge. That did, however, change in the 1980s when his daughter, Mary Ellis Borglum Vey, started advocating for something to honor her father's original wishes. Together with the Park Service, Mary Ellis was able to see through a project that inserts a sort of time capsule into the entryway of the Hall of Records. Now, there is no public access up there. Unfortunately, you can't go up to see it, and even if you could go up, it is sealed with a 2,000-pound granite capstone. But set into that time capsule, there is a titanium vault lined with teak wood, and then porcelain enamel tablets inserted. And engraved on those porcelain enamel tablets are things like a copy of the Constitution and a copy of the Declaration. There's an explanation of who these 4 faces on the mountain are and why they were selected. And all of that comes together to, in some ways, complete Gutzon Borglum's original vision with that space as being almost this telling of what happened and how it was accomplished, so that in future generations, if we reach a point where cultural memory does not recall why Mount Rushmore exists or who it is, all of those answers are up there and waiting.
One other piece of interesting trivia, Alfred Hitchcock's movie thriller North by Northwest has a famous scene depicting a chase on the face of Mount Rushmore. Well, spoiler alert, that was filmed in a Hollywood studio, although part of the film was in fact shot on location, although it was in a building that has since been torn down. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Lincoln Borglum went on to become the very first superintendent of the Mount Rushmore National Memorial site. It's a post he held for 3 years, completing one of the most incredible father-son projects in U.S. history. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Sarah Beth Cox, a.k.a. Ranger Sarah Beth, when she's on duty at the Mount Rushmore National Memorial in South Dakota. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, when you hear the old saying, go peddle your wares elsewhere, what Connecticut invention was it originally referring to? Well, the answer is Yankee peddlers, the original traveling salesmen. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to take a look at how the infamous Yankee peddler movement actually came into being, creating the business model today that we call consumerism, despite the fact that some peddlers had a reputation at times that left something to be desired. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.